I'd like to reflect with you today on Homer and how Homer was used by the early Christians in the post-apostolic and patristic era as a means of understanding the faith journey and the formation of character. There has been a tendency, an extreme tendency in the Christian tradition following Tertullian and Tatian to probe what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, the academy of the church. That's always been the very extreme marginal position. The other position has been that, in fact, the academy in Athens contributes a great deal to understanding the nature of Christianity, a deeper philosophical, mystical level. But in doing so, many Christians from a more philosophic tradition have tended to either draw mostly from Plato, Aristotle factored in later as well. But the literary tradition, which is very important, has been largely ignored. And yet the early Christians, many of them who did not come from Jewish backgrounds, they would have been raised in a classical civilization. Their sacred texts, in a literary sense, would have been Homer, they would have been Hesiod, they would have been Virgil, Ovid, and many other writers. And really up to 2 generations ago, most people who were educated even in the West, they would have studied Latin, and you would have studied the Greco-Roman classics along with the Bible. And it's really we're only dealing with a couple of generations in which the classics of Western civilization have increasingly been marginalized, including the Bible and classical Greco-Roman thought. This has led to essentially memoricide, or a lack of memory, or the wisdom of the great tradition. Now, Homer was one of the foundation thinkers of that Greco-Roman tradition. His 2 great works are the Iliad and the Odyssey. And many of the early Christians who were not only concerned with theology per se and thinking about God, or how do we interpret God, or the relationship of God to the church, the sacraments, liturgy, they're also interested in the formation and the role of literature in the humanities, in the formation of the soul, the imagination, the mind, and virtue itself, and character development. And Homer played a very, very significant role in that in terms of formation. This could be a series of perhaps a few reflections on Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and how he was used by early Christianity, particularly the Ammas and the Abbas of the church, the mothers and fathers, for formation or in spiritual directing itself. So I'll begin with just a few of these reflections, and I'll see as far as I get, and then perhaps I can continue with other stories from the Iliad and the Odyssey. Let me start with the first one, which anticipates the Trojan War and has an impact in terms of today, as does all of Homer's writings. So that what makes literature great, or great literature, is that it transcends time and place, and it deals with the great perennial themes of the human journey. The first story is about Baucis and Philemon. Zeus and Hermes came down cloaked in time to what today is called Turkey, and a couple of villages. And they came as peasants and poor people, dressed very shabbily. And they went from door to door asking for hospitality. And very important to understand, within Greek culture, hospitality is one of the most important things. So Xenophilia, or the love of the other, the love of the outsider, was foundational to Greek virtue in that sense. And so when Zeus and Hermes came to this particular city, and doors were closed. It was a wealthy city, an affluent city, and again, people would close their doors on them, and Zeus and Hermes would walk away. And eventually they came to the outskirts of the city, and there's this very poor couple, Baucis and Philemon, and they were poor, and they saw these poor people coming to them. They had very little, a few vegetables, a little wine left. But they welcomed them in generously, and they offered them a place to stay. And they were the only ones in this village that were hospitable in that best sense, in terms of the Xenophilia. As Bacchus was pouring out the last little bit of wine, she was frightened because she thought, I could no more care for these guests. We've given the last that we have. And it was at that point, the poor people, as she thought, Zeus and Hermes, the glass kept filling up with wine. It kept filling up with wine. And all of a sudden, Zeus and Hermes were revealed as gods. And he essentially told Bacchus and Philemon that we're going to destroy this city because it has lost its ability to care for the other, the outsider, the foreigner. And we would like you to flee to the hills because a great flood is going to be brought in and bury this city. And so they fled to the hills. The city was buried, but Bacchus and Philemon remained. This was Xenophilia, the love of the neighbor. And so you have this myth in Greek. Now, the other, which leads to the Trojan War, of course, is that in Greece, you had Paris of Troy. He comes to visit Menelaus and Helen, the ship that launched the face that launched 1,000 ships. Now, they were meant, of course, Paris was meant to, he was being treated hospitably. He was the foreigner. He was the outsider. The Greeks were very... as I said, the whole xenophilia, not xenophobia, dominated. So you welcome the outsider. But what Paris did, he was a bit of a fop and a cad. Increasingly, to what degree Menelaus and Helen had a bit of a rocky marriage is always the big question. But Paris spirited away with Helen and fled back to Troy. So here you have hospitality being taken advantage of. What happens when, in fact, people are generous, xenophilia, and people then take advantage of kindness, of hospitality, of generosity? Well, so at that point, of course, then Menelaus, his brother Agamemnon, and all the Greeks sail to Troy, and this is the beginning of the Trojan War, which Homer then recounts in the Iliad itself. And so there's a tension here in the beginning of the Iliad, which Homer very much articulates. And Homer isn't going to side particularly with one side or the other. He recognizes the horror, the tragedy of war between the Trojans and the Greeks. So it's not a simple patriotic tract in which rah Greeks, boo Trojans. In fact, he realizes that war is complex and there's reasons for it. But underneath the war is the notion of hospitality being taken advantage of. We can see this played out today in the issue of immigration and refugees, where on the one hand, you'll have countries receive refugees, but what happens when refugees and immigrants are received and they begin to take advantage of the country that they've been received in, where they move into ghettos, where terrorists emerge from it? Well, this then bursts the conservatives on the right, which want to limit the number of immigrants, refugees coming in, and the liberals who want to be much more what we would call a xenophilia versus a conservative xenophobic. But both have reasons for their positions, and this goes all the way back to the Bacchus, Philemon, the rise of the Trojan War itself that Homer recounts in the Iliad. So one of the first underlying things is, how do we make sense of the tension, on the one hand, of openness to hospitality, xenophilia, but what happens when hospitality and kindness is taken advantage of by people who are brought in this case, obviously Paris and Helen fleeing off to Troy. Then you get war, you get political war, and you get parties and ideologies fragmenting between the conservative reaction, so it's often seen as xenophobia, and the liberal xenophilia. This then takes us into, of course, the Iliad. The Iliad, of course, what Homer's at again is that life is struggle. This is where you get the Greek notion of agon. Often the nature of the journey, the utopian types want through dialogue, through discussion, that in fact things will work out well through discussion, through international organizations. But what happens when you have two nations, two peoples who interpret their history, who understand who they are differently, and both are aggressive? You get the protagonist and you get the antagonist. And Homer was not naive. He recognized, in fact, that life is struggle, and then what is the nature of that struggle and how is it going to end? Now, of course, the Trojan War itself was a 10-year war in that sense, and war itself is not necessarily comedic or tragic. And in the Greek understanding of the comedic and tragic tension, the issue is if we go off to do what is just, if we go off to do what is right in this case, because Helen was spirited off by Paris to Troy, then we'll be justified in what we do. It will be a comedic, it will be a happy ending. But in fact, the Trojan War led to immense tragedy. Thousands and thousands of men, women, children died in the process. So there was the tragic element. And what Homer essentially is saying, be wary of taking sides simplistically, naively, patriotically in the midst of war, because tragedy will ensue. And even though one of the two sides seem to be victorious, in fact, there will be much tragedy and suffering on both sides. And again, you see Homer very much reflecting that life is this tension between the comedic, in which we hope the ending will be good, but in fact, often when we enter in tensions and clashes, and we could fast forward this to the culture war today's, between those who are on the progressive left and those who are on the reactionary right, there's the agon, there is the struggle, but often in the midst of this, where there is not dialogue, where there is polarization, you tend to get tragedy in that sense. People are not listening to one another, and the sadness that comes as a result of that. The Iliad itself, as I said, lasts 10 years. Another story that comes out of this is Odysseus, which of course is a key figure, not only Iliad, but also in the Odyssey. He leaves home just as his son Telemachus is birthed by the mother Penelope. He's called to war to justify what has happened to Menelaus and Agamemnon as they go to war to the Trojans. Gone for 10 years, and then it takes him another 10 years to come back. So you have essentially a son who has no father. Another perennial theme of many times throughout history, you have the story of the father off doing important things, in this case war. It can be traveling all over the place or a workaholic, but rarely at home to raise the children. And what then happens in terms of when you have an absentee father or an absentee mother? And how do children then find their way when there is no meaningful modeling for the children? And so the story of Odysseus slowly finding his way back home, and mother Penelope has to play the role of mother and father. And in one sense, she's the heroine of the Odyssey, even though Odysseus is often seen as the one who goes through all the struggles and difficulties. She's the wily Penelope who knows how to fend off, not through war, but through cunning and incense, all the suitors who are trying to and wanting to marry her and to take over Ithaca itself. And so you have this very thoughtful woman, Penelope, who knows how to outsmart the men in terms of protecting Ithaca, protecting the castle, while her husband is gone. He's not the husband he should have been. He's not the husband she would hope for, and yet she's there to raise her son Telemachus. So there's another perennial theme of what happens when children do not have parents who are consistently there for them. They're off busy at work, often busy doing all sorts of things, but they're not there to shepherd, not there to shepherd the children at all. That's the part of the background to the story of the Odyssey itself, and Odysseus' long journey coming home, partially his own fault because of arrogant decisions, partially because also the people who he chooses to associate with, who make bad decisions, and he then is caught up in all of that problem itself. And so the Odyssey is the story, and I'll just move one more step on this, and then perhaps I can get on to later in terms of the many bypaths Odysseus took, whether it was with Cyclops or Circe, or the Lotus drinkers, or Scylla and Charybdis, or Circe and the Sirens. But the other key point here is that in the Odyssey, Ulysses longs to get home. Now that can be seen literally, home to Ithaca, but it's also the search for the home of the soul, Where is the place in which a person can find their rest, and what is the journey that one must take to find that? The image which is used, of course, is the boat. So the issue in the Odyssey, who are we sailing on? Who are we sailing with to get to where we want to go in terms of place and rest in Ithaca? And what happens if we're on with wrong sailors on an inappropriate boat? What then happens to the journey home? And so what the Odyssey very much signals is asking the question, when we're trying to get home, literally, in this case to Ithaca, to Penelope and Telemachus, who are we on the boat with? And are these good people to be on the boat with? And how do we discerningly know what boat to get on to sail back home? And what are the temptations that can distract us from getting home? And much of the sailing of the ship is raising those points again and again. Interesting enough, it's a ship, and a ship is about community. So as much as Odysseus and the Odyssey is about the individual returning, it's also about how do we sail with a community home? What sort of community are we on the ship with, and who's dependable on that ship? There's also sailing over the water of time. So what is a part of the journey is not only the people we are with, but the political context we're thrown into, what Heidegger talks about, our thrownness. And so there's the people we sail with across the water of time in the hope of getting home, but there's also the inclement political context we're thrown into. So we could be talking today about COVID, we could be talking about vaccines, we could be talking about larger political issues. And so there's a whole range of ambiguous and unpredictable factors that have to be dealt with on the journey across the water back home, and how does one navigate that? And there's also then, of course, there's sailing across water. Water, and you go deeper into it, is the symbol of the subconscious or the unconscious. And so often people only live at a purely irrational level, and they're not aware of what's deeper within them. That has serious implications of how they sail across the water of time as well. And what Homer is dealing with here is be careful of who you're sailing with, who we listen to on the journey, the nature of the context we're sailing in, and be in touch with a deeper sub or unconscious reality that is even deeper than the ship itself. Because if we're not aware of that, then the sailing back to Ithaca can lead to all sorts of problems. And so maybe perhaps what I'll do another time is reflect then on the many temptations, distractions, detours that Odysseus and the crew had on the way back from Troy to Ithaca. But the early church, as it looked at the Odyssey, to read it allegorically, of course, the ship is the ship of state. If you go into a sanctuary, most classical churches, it's patterned after the ship. You can even see Odysseus, for example, as the sirens. He's hugging the mast, which was seen as the cross, and put wax in the ears of the sailors. So obviously with the sirens is what do we choose to listen to? What do we block out with wax in the ears of our soul? And what happens if we listen to the wrong voices? Where does it lead us? And so Odysseus knew very clearly as they passed by the sirens that he did not have the strength. So he had to tie himself to the mast on the ship of the church. And then the sailors had to put wax in their ears. So part of spiritual formation itself is be wary of the sirens that whisper, that allure, that seduce, because if we don't have wax in the ears of our soul, we can be drawn off in directions that take us far from Ithaca, the home of the soul.